the Premier League TV deal is critical for the football ecosystem in Europe, because what you do if you're an Italian team and an English Premier League club comes after one of your players, it's like, right, that value's just gone up by 30%. Soccer could overtake a sport like the NFL or the NBA in 50 years. I think there's an opportunity for them to do so. Will it happen in the next 10 to 15? Absolutely not. I went with my dad and we stood in the Stretford end, Manchester United against Southampton, watched Matt Le Tissier score, and then Dennis Irwin scored a penalty at the Stretford end, and I was swamped with Manchester United fans.
Welcome to the Football Economy, the show where we impact the financial forces driving soccer's global evolution. I'm Ibrahim, and today we're diving through the transformative moments of sport, how innovative ownership, media shifts, and new regulations are reshaping the sports landscape. To break it all down for us, I'm joined by Professor Rob Wilson, a sport finance expert with over 25 years in higher education and strategic advisory. He directs executive education at UCFB, consults for Play It Forward, advising clients on financial strategy and leadership in global sport. And Professor Rob is a trusted media voice. You can find him everywhere from major outlets such as BBC, Sky Sports, and the Financial Times. So yeah, welcome Rob to the podcast.
Thanks ever so much for the invitation. Looking forward to speaking about it all.
Perfect. So I think the first thing I'd like to deep dive into is your motivation for being in the sports finance industry. What would you say was the aha moment for you in terms of discovering that, okay, I have this financial background, or I have this ability to dive into the finances of institutions outside of sports, if that was the case with you, and then realize that I could merge it up with my, love or affinity for football?
Of course, a couple of things then, and I'll try and unpack them briefly for you. So I was always interested in finance and accounting, did some work experience at 2 or 3 accountancy firms before I joined a university. And just whilst I enjoyed the finance side of it, I didn't really want to be an accountant, or didn't think I wanted to be an accountant. So my sport took me to Sheffield and I undertook a sport management program. Again, just kind of really enjoyed the finance and the economic side of that, started to teach. And I think very quickly realized that teaching was not about academic theory all the time. You had to have an understanding of what an industry was doing. And in my case, that was sport management. Football is a global games. Started to dive into the financial operations of football clubs, understanding financial health, working out why so many clubs are going out of business, and so on and so on. Wrote a book. I don't know if the book was a good idea or not. I don't think my wife was very impressed at the time because it takes up an incredible amount of home time. But having written that book, I then started to do a couple of media interviews. And I think the hallelujah moment for me was rather randomly stood in a disused car park opposite Sheffield Wednesday Football Club back in 2009 when they were being petitioned by the High Court for a winding up order on behalf of the tax authorities over in the UK, and kind of started to really understand why it had come about, how it had come about, the irrational decision making, I think, at football clubs. And that really propelled my interest in research. But I think more critically, me trying to go out and networking with senior leaders in those sports organisations to understand what pressures they were under. I guess kind of fast forward then 15 years or so, huge number of publications in and around that space, but really lit that fire to be in and around the boardrooms, training now chief executives, sporting directors, so I can really start to work at the intersection of theory and practice, and hopefully the research that we do has a tangible and material impact on the shape of the sport industry and of the football industry more specifically. And that's why I run Play It Forward Sports Advisory as well, because it gives me an opportunity to work hand in hand with those people that are making decisions.
I think you mentioned something there that is quite revealing. So you mentioned that you worked on a book called if I'm not mistaken, Economics of Sports, or the Economics and Finance of Professional Team Sports. I think you worked on that book with Dr. Dan Plumley, who we had early
right.
on.
Yeah.
So I mean, I've done like not like a deep dive on the book, but I've done like an overview, research on the book, very, very quickly. What is striking to me is that the book is like a very compelling take on the evolution of the sports industry in general, from golf to rugby to NFL, but obviously it focuses on football, because obviously there are more prevalent examples that can be taken from football. My question to you when it comes to that is that we can see the ownership models that have come into football have basically evolved from state-backed ownership models to private ownership models. And then obviously now we have private equity come into play. Do you have would you say it's right to personalize a new term called the celebrity ownership model when we talk about Wrexham? Is that acceptable by you?
I think it would be. That book was really interesting. So Dan was my undergraduate student, postgraduate student, PhD student, supervised him for a long, long time. And that book was really born out of one of the modules we used to teach for final year students, which would bring together Dan's research, my research, the teaching area, and all those connections we were having. And we were looking at the impact of those different ownership styles and the output that had on sport. So we'd grown up with Sheikh Mansour taking over at Manchester City, for example, and really kind of disrupting the sector entirely. And I think you're right to point out that celebrity style ownership. I think it's geared up around making profits ultimately, but certainly swelling revenues and utilising and leveraging that celebrity endorsement, that celebrity power really to take those clubs forward. Of course, we have it at Wrexham, we have it at Birmingham City. There'll be some other examples, I'm sure, fairly soon. Very recently, of course, David Beckham and Gary Neville doing a buyout at Salford, which kind of really propels their brands as well. So yeah, look, there's a new area of research there that we'll certainly start having a look at over the next few years for sure.
I mean, you mentioned David Beckham and Gary Neville's recent takeover of Salford City, but there's also a recent one with Tony Bloom of Brighton. I think he has like a just under £10 million investment in Hearts in Scottish League. What do you think he's seeing that other investors are not seeing? Because I mean, we're all aware that the Scottish League is obviously a potentially undervalued league in that sense, but we know the issues they've had. And I mean, not too long ago in history, in your book, actually, I saw this where they experimented, and we refer to this in the discussion as we go along. But they had experimented with the sort of like the personalized over broadcasting sort of like model when it comes to like having control of the DTC access to their fan base. And obviously League One is trying to do that now, but specifically around the Tony Bloom investment, what would be the sort of like the motivation for that? I know he said it's disruptive in nature in terms of like his intention, but what is he seeing that other investors are not seeing?
I think that Undervalued plays a huge part in it. If we just lean back into Wrexham with the ownership there, what they saw was this historically undervalued asset that had a lot of history and big community impact that they're able to leverage. I think what we're seeing with Tony is very experienced investor, probably if we move away from the absolute numbers, probably one of the most successful Premier League club owners that we've ever seen, certainly in terms of the investment in and the output on the field with the kind of game model that they run at Brighton. You would say similar for what we're seeing at Brentford. And I think with Scottish football, there is history and heritage there. There is an interest in it, but you also have that duopoly of the old firm, although I'm sure the Celtic fans will say actually it's a bit of a monopoly for the Hoops right now. And I think what you get with Hearts is similar to Wrexham, historic club, big fan base, geographically quite interesting, but in a league that has one or two teams that are really competing. So for a relatively modest investment, and right, 10 million isn't modest to some people, but it certainly will be to him. For a relatively modest investment, you can have a material impact on the playing performance of that squad and over time perhaps try and break up that duopoly. And if you're able to do that, let's say they have a fabulous season, they end up being able to win the division, you're into Champions League, then you're into, 80 million euros plus of revenue, and that becomes transformative. And I think Scottish football is ripe for that investment because it actually needs more than just those dominant two teams.
Yeah, I do agree. And I've also sort of done some research on Scottish football, considering the fact that we are potentially looking at where can we look at advising companies or sports clubs there in that sense. So still sticking to the multi-club ownership model, we do know the City Football Group in a way, and I think your book, I'm going to refer to your book a lot in this conversation because it's a very compelling, sort of like holistic content for understanding the sports industry, specifically football. But yeah, so the multi-club sort of like model in that sense, I think City Football Group pioneered that. So Man City, the main club in that sense. What would you say is the future of multi-club ownership models? I know Michelle of the owner of the London Lionesses, So
Michelle
she's
Kang. Yeah.
Michelle Kang, yeah. So she's also taken on that multi-club ownership model. Do you think regulatory bodies are going to clamp down on that in the near future, or do you think they're going to encourage it until they feel like it's now a potential threat to the status quo?
It's a good question. You have kind of the City Football Group and Red Bull, don't you, as the kind of pioneers of that multi-club group. Very different rationales behind those investment models, actually. So Red Bull all around kind of brand awareness, exciting football, a much flatter tiered approach to their multi-club group versus the City model, which, as you rightly say, is more pyramid in structure. I think what we've started to see with that pyramid structure is where it begins to fragment and disintegrate in the middle and the lower tiers, because you bring in so many different clubs, and it has an impact on the fan bases and the fandoms that exist around it. And I think almost a loathing sometimes that a player is going to come into a club at the bottom of the pyramid and will ultimately be transferred up to the top group. Michelle is doing something different in women's football, stated objectives right at the outset that she wanted to build a multi-club group for women's football that I think critically were detached from those men's teams, because I still think there's an over-reliance of women's football on the men's game. And actually, if it can identify, as London City Lionesses are doing, that you can stand on your own 2 feet, you can wash your face financially, and you can improve that competitive integrity. Ultimately, I think you can make some money, but also promote and develop the game that's there. To go back to your question now, I think we're starting to see an evolution of multi-club groups into what I think we now call multi-sport groups. And I think that's where if we're going to talk about profit and revenue generation here, the work that Dan and I do through Invest in Soccer, where we're looking at valuations of clubs, what you can start to see is that the ecosystem around a multi-sport group suddenly becomes much more interesting. So take Nottingham Forest as a for instance. You kind of have this weird MCO model because the owner has Nottingham Forest Football Club, he also has Olympiacos, but then they're investing heavily in Women's Super League netball through Nottingham Forest. So you're beginning to get a proper multi-sport model that's emerging in that club. You can share your executives, you can share intelligence, you can do your data collection differently and make it much more efficient as an operating model. And that should then translate onto the field of play or the court if it's netball, basketball, whatever it might be. I think whilst we'll see multi-clubs stay, I think multi-sports will become more prevalent. And I think from a regulatory perspective, we are starting to now see real issues, aren't we, with clubs within those multi-club groups starting to qualify for similar competitions. In football, UEFA have to then make a ruling on certain things. It's limiting player flow for some clubs. If you go back to last summer with Ineos and their stake in Manchester United, they weren't really allowed to sell, I think it was Jean-Claire Todibo, wasn't it, from Nice to Manchester United. He ended up going to West Ham, and then there was a problem with the participation in the UEFA competitions as well. So I think regulators will look at that much more keenly over the coming years, and we'll start to see some real casualties of that system, particularly when it's in a pyramid structure in an MCO.
Right. And then there's something I really want. This is like a selfish question because I'm very sort of like driven by trying to understand the women's football games, so soccer, both in the MLS, so both in the US market, but also in Europe. So my question to you is basically around, where do you think the opportunities are when it comes to trying to extract or generate value from the women's game, when you consider the fact that women's football clubs in England specifically are most likely, or in most cases, affiliated with the men's football team? Do you think potentially clubs could license their women's team to outside investors who would be interested in basically unearthing that brand value? As you're well aware that when you take out a subsidiary from sort of like a group, the subsidiary potentially could be worth more than the actual group itself, or the parent company. For instance, YouTube, for instance, has way more value outside of the Google Alphabet parent group, as opposed to sitting inside. But then the same case could be put for different entities. So specifically around that case, what do you think the opportunities are?
Yeah, so I don't think it's in the Women's Super League, actually. I think they are so wedded to the top club, the men's team, that financial flow is in such demand because we have a thirst to consume women's football. Brands are much more interested in it. Media companies are more interested in it. I think there's also a kind of optics around it. If you think back to Manchester United not having a women's team not so long ago, they were getting panned in the media, panned on the terraces, and really exposed for not looking to be equal in their treatment of teams, and have had loads of bumps in the road subsequent to setting up their women's team. So I think that's still a pathway that will be necessary for the growth of the game at that top level. But I think the real opportunities are actually sub-Women's Super League, clubs like Doncaster Rovers Bells, for instance, who are slightly separated. I think there could be a huge amount of brand value in the Donny Rovers Bells as compared to Doncaster Rovers Football Club, because of history, because of heritage, because of the fact that they are smaller than those big Women's Super League teams. And I think you can really then invest small amounts of money, have a material impact on the field, and actually then start breaking into those big groups. So I think your analogy is really useful with YouTube and Google, because those teams that are outside of the men's game, I think, have got real potential. And let's be honest, going back to Michelle Kang, whilst she has a philanthropic and a utopian ideal around what she wants to see for the women's game, let's not beat around the bush. She's acquiring clubs that are high profile. They are centred in major cities at the moment, and they will have tangible value to both her and the ownership group, as well as, of course, benefiting the football ecosystem that they're playing within.
Yeah, I mean, I sent out a post on LinkedIn basically highlighting this, saying, she said, basically, I'm in it to make sure I extract value for myself and my investors. But at the same time, I'm trying to make sure that women have more of a say when it comes to sports, which is common sense. But yeah, so transitioning to media disruptions and potentially fan engagement, I mean, we've all seen the sort of like the saga when it comes to League One in terms of like the broadcasting rights and media deals. Raw obviously did not go well, and Dazan now the same thing. They're having issues with them, and I think that they've mediated that, where 100 million euros, I think, would be basically 100 million euros would be used to basically offset production costs for them to go towards the DTC rights and DTC routes in that case. My question in this sense is basically, where do you think this stems from? Like, where do you think originally the problem of League One being able to potential revenues or justified revenues from its broadcasting rights? Are they potentially not seeing a way of like branding the league better, or is it just inherent in terms of like the fact that League One is just way behind, and there are other systematic issues that need to be addressed first? That's one. But the second question would be also just on focus on the D2C model itself. I know it's been done with the Scottish League. Obviously not the right time in that sense, but also I think the MLB has pioneered this very, very well, the Major League Baseball. So they've obviously have like the MLB TV, but also their direct to consumer sort of like personalized model, where they have access to all the intricacies of the players, but also the ability to get a very niche understanding of their consumer habits. So in that sense, do you think this is a new frontier when it comes to football, or are we like way too early to decide that?
It's such a complex, multi-layered question. And I say that because I've always been of the view that the Premier League actually sold out to Sky 2 or 3 iterations of their broadcasting deal ago. You have this kind of almost monopoly, don't you, with Sky broadcasting the English Premier League. It fuels the balance sheets of the clubs that participate in the competitions, and they become beholden then to that TV cash to then fuel the transfer market, fuel player wages, so on and so forth. But the value of the Premier League is such that I think you could do an in-house production where you go to D2C and actually make a lot more money than they're probably getting from Sky. But because of the interrelationship between the broadcaster and the competition, we haven't seen that break off. So I say that up front for your question, because I think the world of football is watching what's going to happen with Ligue 1. I think broadcasters will be relatively concerned about what might happen with Ligue 1. DAZN haven't been able to do anything with it. There is a functional issue with the competitive integrity and competitive balance of Ligue 1, because it is not a competitive division. You have one specific team right at the very top and a couple that are also knocking around behind Paris Saint-Germain. And unless you can improve your uncertainty of outcome through, this is where we're going to go into the theory now, which is in the book. Unless you can improve your uncertainty of outcome and improve, therefore, that competitive balance, you won't get eyes on screens and bums on seats and euros spent at turnstiles. So I think it's a calculated gamble by Ligue 1 to decide to go down this DTC route. They clearly think that they are able to generate a better return on their investment than they would be able to if they sold those rights. That's not to say that somebody wanted to pay for those rights, which is why I think they've had so many issues. Very similar, actually, to what we saw in the English Football League Championship when they renegotiated with with Sky, and the value of the deal went up. I think it was about £650 million over a set period of time. And you had 2 or 3 clubs that were really upset about that, said it undervalued the league. And then you had other clubs that were like, wow, all our Christmases have come at once, because they were funneling money in to the clubs that they could only dream of. But you have likes of Leeds United, Sunderland, Middlesbrough, bigger entities thought they could do better. And interestingly, this D2C model has got another layer to go. So if they can prove it on a league level, then the next thing that we will see start happening is clubs demanding club-to-club DTC models, i.e. Manchester United command their own TV media rights. They sell those media rights to people that want to consume Manchester United content, and they will make hundreds of millions more than a load of other teams in the league. And I want to go back then to a point you made earlier about regulators. This is where the governance structure and the regulation is so critical, because if you allow individual teams to start running D2C models, then you completely destroy the competitive balance and integrity of your division. Those teams get much, much bigger. We would say a club like Manchester United and Liverpool pull so far away from the rest because of their earning power that you'd end up with a Scottish Premier League version of Rangers and Celtic, just commanding the league year on year. And actually you would destroy the fabric of the competition. And dare I say, and I know, we might go down this route at some point, but dare I say that's where the European Super League idea will rear its head again. So I'm dancing around your question. Hugely complicated. Everybody's looking to see what happens with Liga, and if they can make it work, then get ready for a wave of D2C modelling elsewhere, and some of the big broadcasters losing a huge amount of market share.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's inevitable at some point. Like, if you think about it, D2C model is like a model that's been prevalent in e-commerce for a long time, and it works for a reason, because you get those consumer habits that you can't get in a general model. And obviously, when it comes to what you mentioned, when it comes to the individual clubs having that sort of like D2C model, that I don't think would happen, only because, like you said, regulation come into play, but it destroys the whole essence of the sports. The way it is right now, you need clubs to be competitive, to be able to obviously sell the package of a Premier League to overseas interest or consumer markets. But if you're going to, have this ability of each club to sell it to whatever fan base they want to sell it to, then the whole point of having a club, a league called the Premier League doesn't exist anymore. It deteriorates eventually. But yeah, so moving into the MLS specifically, there's this piece, there was a conference done by Sports Bro. And I think the MLS sort of executive, Kevin Demoff, he was basically saying that it's a good time to be in the US sports industry. Why? Because obviously, specifically soccer. Why? Because you have the Club World Cup and then you have the FIFA World Cup next year. And he was basically saying that because we have the stadiums and they're going to be done in our stadiums, we can get this data and then understand who's actually interested in, identify who's actually interested in soccer in the US market. Do you think, hearing that, do you think that US clubs are significantly undervalued? I know it's a provocative question in the sense that it's already, they have sky high, valuations, even more than most Premier League clubs in that sense. But still at that, do you think we're still at the early stages, considering how early how young the MLS is as a league? Do you think we're still, the valuations are actually kind of not that high in that sense?
Yes, I do. Not sure if you've ever spoken to Neil Joyce from the Customer Lifetime Value Group, but he speaks really fluently about the market opportunity in the States. And I think it's going to be the key battleground, actually. We hear a lot about European teams wanting to go and tour the Far East and parts of Southeast Asia and into Australasia. But America, North America in particular, is an absolute key territory now for Premier League teams. And it's twofold in reason. One is, when you look at Neil's research, the fandoms that are prevalent in the US are much more mature than they are in the UK and in mainland Europe. There are no qualms in paying $100 for a pay-per-view boxing match, so you can therefore optimize your broadcast rights packages. That has a direct impact on franchise value, by the way. Then you have this background of actually US fans will have an MLS following or a USL, and they will also then follow a team in Europe. And actually, again, go back to Neil's research, you can't really pinpoint the big teams within that research. The usual suspects appear. So Manchester United appear, Paris Saint-Germain appear, Juventus have got a little bit, Real Madrid, Barcelona, a little bit of Liverpool. So that market is waiting, it is kind of open to be captured by somebody. And if the MLS can capture that, which is what the Messi move was all about fundamentally, if the MLS can capture those fandoms and stop the European teams coming over and extracting loads of value, then their profit and loss accounts will go up considerably because their match day takings will go up, their merchandise sales, the sponsorships, and then the broadcasts. And that will have a direct impact on the franchise valuation. And then because of the governance structure and how the MLS operate with the salary cap, you are protecting, and this is the critical point about American sport, you protect that competitive integrity and that competitive balance in the divisional formats, which means every year you should have a different winner of the league, much like you see in the NFL and the Super Bowl, albeit Kansas City Chiefs have been pretty impressive over the last few years. But by protecting that integrity and that competitive balance, you simply fuel an increase in franchise value because more and more people are interested in. And it's, pretty basic model they operate in the NFL. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see how it works. And you apply that to the MLS and the maturity of the US market, the absolute thirst that the US market seems to have now for soccer. I think they're massively undervalued. And we will be talking about clubs changing hands for several $1 billion before too long.
So, I have a second follow-up question. It's also a two-part question. The first one would be, do you think that soccer in that sense, or football, can overthrow, the top, well, I think it's probably top three now at this point. Do you think it can overthrow the first major supported or interested sports in the US in the long term, maybe the next 50 years? And then the second question is, a lot of people speak about, other markets, emerging markets, when it comes to where can we expand soccer and football in terms of a global expansion strategy. And we don't hear much said about the Indian markets. You just mentioned maturity and the market being ready in the US. But would you consider the Indian market as a market that potentially has a very strong interest in football and needs to have that cultivation in terms of like infrastructure development, in terms of like outside investment, in terms of like developing the grassroots? You think that's something that international European football clubs should consider in terms of like being early to that sort of market, especially with the middle class growing in terms of their spending power? Do you think that's something that European clubs should be prioritizing as a strategy for the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so go to your previous question first. Do I think that soccer could overtake a sport like the NFL or the NBA in 50 years? I think there's an opportunity for them to do so. Will it happen in the next 10 to 15? Absolutely not. But they will break into that kind of top three, I think. Sports like baseball and hockey, I think, are going to have to really be watching over their shoulder as soccer kind of starts to take hold in those fandoms and in those markets. The India question is fascinating because it is quite a mature sport market. Nobody, and I mean nobody, has really tried to get into that market other than La Liga a few years ago when they tried to do a bit of a broadcast deal, which hasn't actually yielded any real tangible return for them. So the Indian market is open. I think you can absolutely sell European football into that market, and you can do the proper pyramid structure, from participation up through to top league. They've got some big issues around, for me anyway, big issues around governance of soccer. My most recent PhD student, Dr. Sartak Mondal, actually looked at the governance structure and the impact that had on competitive balance and integrity, and it is fraught with issues as a domestic competition, which again opens the door for European leagues or another league to start selling rights in. I think what you have though in India, which is absolutely unique to India and the Indian subcontinent, is that cultural desire and that thirst for cricket. And we often forget about cricket in the bigger conversation around world sport, but the IPL is one of the biggest and most lucrative sporting competitions in the world that is broadcast to a population of 1.4 billion people, and they are fanatical about it. So football has got two challenges, therefore. One is breaking into the India market generally, and you're right to point out the middle class is expanding, so they've got more disposable income to consume that. But they've also then got to try and become the second sport in India, which I think is going to be pretty challenging. And ironically, it's probably why European clubs haven't really tried to break into that market so far, because of the control that you've got through the BCCI and through IPL cricket. And of course, how well India have been doing in that cricket space as well. I think the IPL will begin to rival the Premier League and the NFL as the most watched league in the world, and certainly the most lucrative. So that's where if I had money to invest, I'd be investing it in the IPL, put it that way.
Yeah, I know. A lot of investors are running towards that, and it makes sense that any European strategy for India would have to consider what's the duration or what's the term in terms of like the return on investment. How long will we have to wait for significant returns? And that's probably why you don't see that much investment in the market. Okay.
Yeah. And we've started to see it come back the other way, though, haven't we? So the Indian market is investing in English cricket. They took big stakes in the 100 franchises, and that was really to promote the IPL. So we can do some cool stuff in England with those 100 franchises, which are like tiny compared to the IPL ones, but it fuels interest within the market. Look at the number of people that are participating in cricket on the east coast of the States, for instance, up around Boston, where you've got those migrating Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi families. The sport is being played across the US. And if you crack the US, as we've just said, there's a huge amount of money to be made. So I think cricket's coming to become a serious player on the world stage.
Quite ironic because the British invented cricket, but yeah. Transitioning towards regulation and financial sustainability, which is always going to be a hot topic when it comes to football. I know the independent regulator, the chairman in that sense, David Colgan, he just had like a hearing at the Sports and Culture Minister, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, DCMS, yeah.
He was basically saying he's not a labor puppet, but that's a different conversation. In terms of his suitability for this role, I think most people or most interest parties would accept that he's well qualified. In terms of whether there's going to be a bias, we're not too sure. But one thing that I did notice that is quite revealing is that they've sort of like integrated a new let's say a clause or word in the bill that says that Premier League or English football cannot be played overseas. Overseas games cannot happen. I think this has happened recently. What's your take on this? Is this something that you feel like is short-sighted? And obviously, we do have the counter arguments or side is that, we have overseas games being played. It's just in pre-season. So what's the point of having actual Premier League games being played? It might dilute the actual authenticity of the sport. But what's your perspective on this?
It's a good question. It's a good appointment. I applied to join that independent regulator. They turned me down.
I don't believe it.
So I have to kind of pay homage. Look, I think it's a really good appointment for to be part of the independent regulator, notwithstanding his political associations and where that might take things. And that would be interesting because of the oversight that they have and the impact that then has against, or with rather, UEFA competition and FIFA competition, but probably a conversation for another day entirely once we've got some evidence. Where do I stand on go back to what it used to be called the 39th game, which was never a 39th game because it was supposed to be regular season. So it would have been 36th, 37th, 38th, wouldn't it? But an overseas regular season match, I think the horse has already bolted. We have started to see it with the NBA. We've started to see it with NFL. And actually, that's increasing their global footprints. Over in the UK, more and more people are talking about the NFL. I'm 44 now. You didn't used to talk about the NFL when you were 12, 13, 14, 15. My son's 17. He's watched 2 Super Bowls already. He streams it on TikTok now and again. He has an interest in it, which makes him a customer. By outlawing the opportunity to play those regular season games, facto, they limit the global expansion of the Premier League and English football more generally, and they also limit the revenues that they can earn. And what we need to remember is that there are only so many dollars, pounds, and euros that can be earned through sport across the world. So if you start to lose market share to NFL, NBA, or another sport, then that is less money that's coming into your sport. That's less impressive salaries and paychecks for the players. That's smaller transfer fees. That is smaller company size, which is critical because you've got all this wave of investment. So interesting that the Americans are just backing off a little bit with certainly top elite level football at the moment and looking to explore other opportunities here and there. So I think it's market limiting for the sport. If I put my fans hat on, then I think it's a good thing because actually we have this inherent belief that these clubs belong to us as fans and we want to be able to consume what we choose to consume, even though those stadiums have a fixed amount of size. And you only need to read the narratives about sport tourists coming into Old Trafford or Liverpool or to perhaps a lesser extent Manchester City, but it's certainly happening. And the disdain actually that those so-called local traditional fans have. My argument is when I speak to people about what is the local market for Manchester United, if somebody says to me it's Manchester, it's like, give your head a wobble. The local market for Manchester United is the 4 corners of the globe because they've got fans all over the place. The local market for Port Vale, by contrast, will be that local community. And I think we need to accept that those clubs, whilst they are hugely important community assets, have got global relevance. So a fan in Tokyo is no less relevant than a fan in Manchester for Manchester United. On the contrary, they're probably more valuable because they spend more money. So I think the ruling will certainly limit the expansion. And I would imagine, will limit the amount of money that the clubs can earn as a consequence of it, notwithstanding the tools that you mentioned already.
Yeah, but in terms of regulation itself and governance, I mean, where do you stand when it comes to, outside opinions saying that, we have like a perfect product here in the sense of, English football. It's like a big ambassador for, the UK. It's gone well. We should not break it when, we don't break something that's already fixed.
Yeah.
Where do you stand when it comes to people saying that we're going to be heavy-handed when it comes to regulation, and people just want to regulate everything that moves? From my understanding, you have like different opinions, but what's your personal opinion?
My personal opinion is that whilst I understand what the roots of independent regulation are, so I'm totally on board with don't change your club colours, don't move your stadium so you can't franchise it. You can't move a club from one area to another because of that cultural attachment. Where I do have an issue is that we have a pyramid structure. There's a pyramid structure because of over 100 years of history. So a club like Manchester United that was born out of Newton Heath in the late 1880s has grown over that 120, 140 year period to the size that the club is now, as have the other clubs, let's say, in the Premier League. The reason that those clubs are big is because fans spend money, is because broadcasters spend money, is because sponsors endorse and provide commercial opportunities. And that is what generates the money that's in the game. If we take that as our revenue generating opportunity, is it right that the money that goes into the Premier League should be distributed more equally right the way through the league system? In my opinion, no. I'm from Cheltenham in the UK, little southwest town. Should Cheltenham Town benefit from the fact that Manchester United and Liverpool are playing in the Premier League? To an extent, through solidarity payments, fine. But all you end up doing is you fuel wage inflation, you fuel transfer fee inflation, and actually you fragment the structure. So I've got some real philosophical concerns with the way the independent regulator will set up. And I think it has the opportunity to be market damaging to a huge degree.
So yeah, I do agree, by the way. And then when it comes to basically transfer fees and the evolution of transfer fees in the industry, I think recently Arsene Wenger, the former Arsenal manager, basically said very said that the strategy that Real Madrid are employing is a very, very sort of like specific strategy when it comes to waiting for players to run down their contracts and sign them on a free. And they're basically saying that this is the new frontier when it comes to signing elite players and not trying to sign them for inflated wages, but also inflated transfer fees. So obviously we know the second order effects would be that agents will obviously have the burden of this. But in terms of like the wider landscape of football, do you think this is the new, sort of like model for acquiring a high value targets in football?
Real Madrid have been at this for years, haven't they? Identifying players and noting that they're 2 years out, so having a little conversation. And the next thing, player benefits hugely because they get bigger wages. Club loses out because there's no transfer fee. Just to go back through that regulatory point, when I talk about independent regulation and financial flow, I've got significant issues. When we talk about things like PSR, FFP, I'm a little bit more on board with that because I think we need to protect clubs against themselves, because there are some pretty bonkers owners out there that will do things that will essentially eviscerate a club if they were given free rein. And that was always my concern, is that you take a club like Manchester City, you pump in 1.5, 2 billion quid. If you then walk away because you've got issues with your other business, or you've just run out of steam and you don't fancy it anymore, you essentially bankrupt the club overnight. It's what happened almost with Roman Abramovich at Chelsea, a point at which he could have said, don't give me any of my money back. And they would have gone into liquidation within about 2 weeks because they were spending 192% wages to turnover ratio, I think it was. Don't quote me on that. It was in and around that value. So essentially, for every £1 of revenue you earn, you're spending £2 out in wages because your owner's supporting you. So I kind of agree with Wenger to a point. I think the transfer market and the ecosystem that sits around it will always be supply and demand led. So if you're trying to buy a world leading number 9 striker right now in Europe, think again, because they're rare as rocking horse droppings, as we would say in the UK. They just don't exist. And therefore the ones that do exist are hugely prized and therefore very, very valuable. Transfer fee goes up, wages goes up, agent fees go up, unless you can do a Real Madrid and extract somebody. If it's a buyer's market because you need a right back, and there are an abundance of right backs because of the Pep Guardiola inverted fullback system that he's pioneered over the last 10 years, then, you're going to have suppressed fees. So I think there will always be a transfer system as we know it. I have some concerns over the way free transfers work and the lack of compensation that some of those clubs get paid. I'm no Liverpool fan, but they were asleep at the wheel with Trent Alexander-Arnold. For me, they should have been renegotiating that contract a long time ago. They didn't. That's on them, as is the fact that they've now had to massively overspend on Mo Salah and Virgil van Dijk to depreciate in assets that they're paying extraordinary amounts to keep them in the squad, when they could have made a lot more money from a transferring of them. Apply that to Manchester United. We've heard a lot, haven't we, about Al Hilal, I think, being interested in him. 120, 130 million. You're running all the way to the bank with that, because he's a fabulous player, but he's a depreciating asset.
Yeah, it definitely. When it comes to, and I do, by the way, I do know you're a Manchester United fan, which I am also. We can get into that in the rapid fire question.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think also I noticed in your book, if I'm not mistaken, it says that football is one sort of like industry, or the sports industry specifically is one industry that is like, sort of like recession proof. And I think you've done a paper on that also. Investors are well aware that there are no tariffs in football. So Trump's tariffs do not affect football, so to speak. You can consider the fact that obviously fans have to come into the US and they may have issues with visas. That's another issue, another topic. Specifically around tariffs. So like if football has no tariffs, then why is UEFA obviously seen as a tariff heavy sort of institution in that sense, with all the trade barriers they put in place?
That's a really good question. I don't think I've got a direct answer for you either on it. I think UEFA in itself is a business, even though it's the regulator, the governance structure, in the same way as FIFA, it's a business. It has to make money. It generates that money essentially on a 4-year cycle through European Championships, as FIFA does through the World Cup. And what it's identified is that it can have flagship competitions like the Champions League, like the Europa League, to a lesser extent the Conference League, where it can extract real value. And I think that is why they look to regulate its clubs, is to protect its own income and to make sure that the governing body is almost, hermetically sealed, untouchable, because there's nothing really to stop other bodies from springing up and starting to try and govern those games and have challenger competitions. But you're competing with an organisation that is billions of euros in size. It creates a monopoly for them.
And then when you consider the fact that, like you mentioned, football is a global game, and we see that, clubs like Real Madrid have a determined strategy in terms of like ever expanding every part of the globe. What do you think local clubs can do, or clubs like lower clubs can do, in terms of trying to emulate the Real Madrid strategy, in terms of having like a very strong community identity, a very strong value associated with the local community, but trying to project that to a global fan base? Where do you see the opportunities are for local or lower league, lower team clubs?
Yeah, I'm glad you qualified that, actually, because I think those smaller teams have got a huge opportunity to create community value, whether that's through participation and running smaller teams, whether that's through expansion through men's, women's, boys, girls, disability teams. I think there are huge opportunities for that. So the club becomes woven into the fabric of the community that it presents. And I don't have any issue with people having a local club affiliation and then, a top club, whether it's a Real Madrid or a Arsenal or whoever it might be. I think you can do both. And I think you've just got to provide an added value opportunity for your community. Relatively inexpensive tickets for entry, kind of community spirit where you actually want to go and hang out and see how that team's doing. And from the team's perspective, look at financial sustainability as your absolute core objective. Stop relying on funding from others, because that might dry up. Run your business, because they are all businesses. Run your business on a proper income and expenditure budget that will either break even or generates a little bit of surplus at the end of the year. Make sure that your selling price is higher than the cost, and make sure you pay your debts as they fall due. And I think you can then build really sustainable community-based clubs that have a material impact on the communities that they serve. A huge opportunity for them. And just because we're not talking about tens of billions or millions of pounds, euros or dollars, quite acceptable to make 25, 30,000. You can make some good return on investment in those community clubs and deliver service to the community as well.
And back to the wage issue or transfer fee issue, do you see a situation where transfer fees just collapse as a result of the strategy that Real Madrid is employing? Obviously, it's a strategy that works for a bigger club, because obviously you can use your brand sort of like power, also your legacy and history, and it works for those sort of clubs. But in terms of like going forward, do you see a situation where basically the transfer fee collapses in terms of like these sky high fees are being commanded by clubs, and obviously that affects lower clubs more than it does the clubs at the top, because obviously they depend more on player sales. So where do you stand on that?
That's good. So from a regulatory perspective, PSR, FFP, FSR, whatever it will be called, helps to manage the transfer system. You know, if we just take it at a very basic level, the kind of your break-even requirement, so you can't spend much more than you earn. That limits the amount of transfer fee inflation that we're starting to see in the market. And this is going to sound really flippant, and I'm sure is much more difficult in practice, but I often think that sporting directors and CEOs forget that there's a little word in their vocabulary, which is no. No, we're not prepared to spend that much money on that player. No, we're not prepared to spend that much money on that player's wages because our budgets dictate what we're able to spend. What happens is they get emotionally charged and they say yes when they know they should be saying no. And that's driven by a system of fear. So if I don't sign that player, my nearest competitor will, and the agent fuels that. So I think collectively teams and leagues have to start saying no a little bit more often, and that will suppress the transfer system to a more manageable and reasonable level, which will help all of the clubs become more sustainable. The other thing we've got to remember with the transfer system is that despite the protests of those in Serie A, in the Bundesliga, in La Liga in particular, and Ligue 1, the Premier League TV deal is critical for the football ecosystem in Europe, because what you do if you're an Italian team and an English Premier League club comes after one of your players, it's like, right, that value's just gone up by 30%. So you see a redistribution of that TV rights into those markets, which then fuels their transfer systems. Unless you take the money out at the top, you're never going to eradicate a transfer system in general. But I really would CEOs, sporting directors, heads of recruitment start saying no a little bit more, and then that will have a material impact on the whole system rather than just for their single club.
So let's have a hypothetical scenario. So you're the CEO of Manchester United. You've come in, you've replaced Omar Barada for whatever reason. And then you're given this task of basically balancing the sporting side of the football club, but also making sure that we don't get left behind by Bayern Munich and Real Madrid in terms of them generating even more. The commercial revenues have not stagnated. United's commercial revenue has stagnated in recent times, linked to the sporting side. What are the key things that you're going to sit down and say, hey, to the management team, this is what we're going to focus on to make sure that United retakes its place at the helm of like European elite clubs?
Yeah, this is going to sound like a cop-out because I actually think they're doing this now. I think what you need to do is you need to look at your recruitment strategy in a holistic form. So what we tend to have is managers that are so scared of losing their job that transfer decisions become very short-term in their focus. So if you look at Manchester United over the last 10 years, trying to buy quick fixes. Now, everybody knows they're quick fixes. The teams that are selling the players know that they're quick fixes, and United are desperate for them, so the price goes up. I think you need to, which I think they've done, draw a very, very deep line in the sand to say, we are no longer going to play this game. We have a 3 to 5 year strategy that we're going to look to execute. We are going to accept this year, much as it pains me to say it, finishing 14th or 15th in the league, because when you look at the way they're balancing their recruitment strategy, I spoke to a guy from Mud Analytics recently, and he pictorially demonstrated this. You need kind of 4 columns of players. Some of those are going to be experienced, but they're on the way out. You need that wave of young players coming through, and then you have 2 columns in the middle. And you have a balanced squad profile so that the players coming through at the bottom become your first team regulars in 3 or 4 years' time. And I think that's what we're seeing with Manchester United. So I'd be doubling down on that strategy if I ever replaced Omar. Don't think I will be. And actually that allows you to operate in a much cheaper market because you're buying younger players for smaller fees and then you're looking to maximise the value. And again, it's not rocket science. You go back to Alex Ferguson's era, when that player gets to almost optimum, that's when you sell them, because you're maximising the value and you know that they're only going to go through a decline, much as fans might not like to see it. And you are using the transfer system to fuel the ongoing transfer system and you build legacy teams rather than in single season teams.
Right. And then a question just to follow up on a conversation we had very early on around Wrexham. So, I mean, Wrexham is obviously at the top of mind of a lot of people right now because obviously they've had 3 consecutive promotions, which has not been done in history of the pyramid. But my specific question around this is basically, we do know that this is rooted, the reason why this happens is because it's rooted on the brand affiliation of Ryan Reynolds specifically and his partner Rob. Where do you see Wrexham taking this to, regardless of whether they get promoted to the Premier League, which is obviously their goal? Whether it happens or not, we're not sure. Where do you see the end game for them? I mean, I do see one side of it, whereas they're starting to shed some parts of their equity and raising the funds that way and partnering with other basically billionaires. But the other side of it is, where do you see them basically being able to get the capital appreciation and they're trying to find in the long term, considering the fact that the reason why the brand is this big is because of Ryan Reynolds' name. So if he leaves, where does Wrexham stand?
So I worked with a company called VSI Executive Education. We had who became one of their executives on our program, a guy called Andy Duff. He's currently at Rochdale, but he went from Wrexham to Everton in the community, I think, and then over to Rochdale. And he said, first day he walked in, he was asked to look at this sponsorship opportunity. And the next thing he knows, he's on the phone with a massive PR firm in New York. And it's like, you have this huge entourage of people because of the owners and that brand exposure that the owners give you. So it's difficult to decouple Wrexham now from the brand value associated with Rob and Ryan against the brand value that Wrexham have started to produce themselves. I was chatting to Steve Phillips, the finance director, and what's really encouraging at Wrexham is they are looking at their budgets carefully and they're not trying to overspend in areas that they don't want to overspend, because they are acutely aware that if Rob and Ryan ever did decide to leave, they have to have a sustainable business that's behind it. So I think we see an inflated value and operation at Wrexham, but the fundamentals of it are actually really sound. Be interesting to see if they go up through, Championship and then into Premier League, because you've got to imagine that's the goal through the whole kind of the Disneyfication of what we've seen there. And as I said earlier, really rich history with that football club. And you wouldn't mind betting that the opportunities on offer to them, far outweigh a lot of their other competitors. So they'll be able to accelerate still further, hence the 3 promotions. Be interesting to see how they do their squad makeup. Lots of, I think, aging players with a lot of experience have been touted to go there. And as long as they keep the wage bill under control and they don't overspend on some of those assets that they won't get money from, then I think they could probably have a bit more to run yet on the story. And because of the numbers involved, you can't see Rob and Ryan walking away just yet, can you?
No, definitely not. But in terms of, so you mentioned squad and wage bill. So I know that Wrexham keep their wage bill, wage to ratio, revenue to ratio, hovering around 41%, 40% in that sense, which is quite low considering what goes on below the pyramid. So what's your take on that?
So yes, it is low, but remember that we're talking about a proportion of revenue in that context. So they turned over, I think, 24 million last year, which means their wage expenditure was, my maths is not that great. So say 9-10 million. That's probably 7 million higher than most of their closest competitors. Much like we see in the Premier League, those clubs with bigger revenue budgets tend to spend more on wages and then proportionally are able to pull away from the rest of their competition. What will become interesting for Wrexham is as they start to play with the big boys, so to speak, they will have to spend more heavily. And if they can't generate the revenue off the field, it will make it much more difficult to spend the money on the wages and still stay under that 50%, which is kind of the, ideally in our world, the guide for what you'd want to be doing.
I think Manchester United is a good example of that. They actually don't spend, you probably know this more than I do, but they actually don't spend that much in terms of like wage, in terms of the wage proportion to revenue compared to other clubs in the Premier League, considering the fact that their revenue is obviously not in competition with anyone in the Premier League in that sense. That's
right. Although, going back to the disaster class that we've seen at Old Trafford for the last 5 or 10 years, they would always keep their wage to turnover ratio around about 48, 49%. It did go up to 65, 70 at one point because they were just spending ridiculous money on wages. They brought that down. People don't talk about it, actually. They talk about the fact they're 14th, 15th in the league. They don't talk about that their wages are now, I think they're out of the top 4 in terms of the absolute amount they spend. So when you start to look at that in relative terms, they are pretty lean now, and it'll be interesting to see how they then build. That is also the benefit of signing younger players because the wages are much lower, and you get your academy graduates through on 9/10 of not very much as well.
Yeah. So let's transition to the rapid fire session. I think the first question I have here is basically, what would you say is the most overrated market for football right now?
In terms of what? Do you mean in terms of the valuation of clubs, or do you mean the valuations of leagues or players?
In terms of the valuation clubs.
That's a good question. I would say the sorts of values that some championship clubs are expecting for their entities. So they are kind of, 40, 50 million pound businesses. And you've got some clubs in there that are looking for Premier League kind of valuations, upwards of 200, 300 million, which is just, a nonsense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then where would you see is the best way to basically enter like the US market in terms of like trying to get closer to the fans? So would you say that would be possible using the esports sort of like route, or is it possible using alternative entertainment routes? Was it collaboration, all the sports that do not cannibalize football necessarily? Where do you see that opportunity coming from?
I think it's all of the above, actually. So I think you've got three distinct market segments there. You've got the activations you can do through esports, whether that's through games like FIFA, where you get people playing with teams and players and you kind of optimize the MLS, whether that's you going out to specific markets to try and generate more interest. I think digital technology is the way to do that because you've got to grab hold of that 16 to 24-year-old market. So make content that's relevant to them, put it out in a framework that's relevant to them. I remember talking to Neil at CLV last year, how do you activate Manchester United in San Diego? We've got a massive Central American influence, so start using anime to promote players like Garnacho and Kobe Mainu, and it captures the imagination, and that's how you break into those markets, I think.
My two last questions would be, the first one would be, what financial metric do you think clubs are sort of like not focused on and they should be? And then the second question would be, what's your favorite memory of Manchester United in your time supporting the club?
So first one first, I think twofold, actually. I think clubs fail to recognise their digital footprint, so they're not activating what some people call followers. They're not monetising those fans, in my opinion. US market is massive for that. I think the Far East market is massive for that. So there is an opportunity to maximise rather, merchandise sales, engagement, use of app technology and things like that, so you can follow behind the scenes opportunities. And then slightly controversially, I think clubs in the Premier League have taken their eye off the ball when it comes to ticket pricing. So I think they should be reducing ticket pricing irrespective of the demand, so they can get more fervent support in their stadiums. And I think that'd have a knock-on effect to commercial value and sponsorship opportunities there. My favourite memory at Old Trafford might be my very first one back in about 94. I went with my dad and we stood in the Stretford end, Manchester United against Southampton, watched Matt Letitia score, and then Dennis Irwin scored a penalty at the Stretford end, and I was swamped with Manchester United fans, and I realised what a community-based club it really was, and everybody was absolutely delighted. I'm not going to be obvious and say when they went to Barcelona and won the European Cup in '99, hopefully they will oust Tottenham Hotspur in the Europa League final, and that will be a very good memory as well. What about you?
Me, it's a good question. I didn't prepare for this, but yeah, I think I'd say, look, an honest one, I'd say the first one that comes to mind is the Paul Scholes goal against Barcelona. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reason why is because I basically thought we're out, like I just couldn't see a way. And then obviously I could, he says that the reason why he scored was that it was a fluke shot. Basically, he didn't hit it properly. I could see that also when I watched it. It's like, this is a fluke shot, but he went in, and I just didn't see us beating, scoring against Barcelona. And that was an amazing experience. I was with friends also, so that would be my favorite. But I've had other very good ones also, but yeah.
There are a club that give you brilliant memories and quite a number of frustrations as well, but let's hope they progress, unlike the last few years.
Yeah, hopefully. And I think clubs like Manchester United eventually come back to being prominent. It's just going to take time. Like with Liverpool has shown, history is very hard to destroy. So, and the fan base is there, but they're doing a very good job of trying to destroy it. And let's see.
Yeah. Let's wait for next season.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Rob. I really appreciate the discussion, and I'm looking forward to having even more in-depth discussions with you. And this was a taste of like your perspective and understanding of the state of football, but also potentially the sports industry. And yeah, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Great to be invited, and really enjoyed it. So thanks ever so much.
Perfect. And yeah, and to you, the listener or the viewer, if you really enjoyed this episode with Professor Rob Wilson, I really appreciate it if you could click subscribe and like and comment and refer this to any like-minded sports fan or football fan that's interested in the business behind the game. Thank you and see you next time.